Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to get a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Bit of a smorgasbord mix today as ever. I'm going to start with the Russian defense industry. This is a Chris O wiki thread, always good to get our teeth into. Our teeth? Not even a word, our teeth into. Russia's defense industry has deep weaknesses that mean it's unlikely to be able to meet government targets for boosting production. According to independent journalists who have interviewed employees working for weapons manufacturers, the Russian government has pledged to greatly increase weapons production to replace war losses, with Dmitry Medvedev setting a target of 1,500 new tanks per year, but that target seems unlikely to be met, according to independent Russian news outlet Verstka. Verstka's reporters have spoken to workers at Uralvagonzavod (UVZ) in Nizhny Tagil, Russia's largest armored vehicle manufacturer. It expanded to a 3-shift operation and is advertising for many skilled metalworking roles at salaries from 100,000 rubles, $1,287. However, workers there and at other arms manufacturers say that poor wages, difficult working conditions, staff shortages, unfilled vacancies, and so-called voluntary compulsory donations for the war effort are seriously undermining production. A UVZ worker explains why positions go unfilled despite the new orders. Quote, "The wages that are announced are for 300 plus hours a month at a rate of 174,000, and these salaries are for the locals who have worked for many years with high grades, who make the most expensive parts. But the newcomers run away in a month when they see the real wages. The real wages," the workers say, "are as low as 40,000 rubles or $516 per month for a normal working schedule. To make the higher salary, someone would have to work around the clock, stopping only to sleep. This clearly isn't a realistic scenario." Despite the increase in work, bosses have often not increased wages. At Strela Production Association JSC in Orenburg, a manufacturer of drones and missiles, engineers are paid 42,000. That's for $546, while locksmiths and millers get only $30,390 a month. People think that we are paid fabulous money here in the defense industry, saying that because this special military operation is going on, our salaries are big. There is no such thing. For the last 3 years, I've been getting pennies, and I still do, says one worker. Defense workers are also unhappy at their company's habit of making them pay voluntary compulsory contributions. This is a common practice in Russian state-owned organizations, including in the army, where junior officers are made to pay for barracks maintenance. Quote, "As early as last year," a UVZ worker says, "we were forced to sign applications to donate our daily salaries to some kind of support fund for the special military operation. It was impossible not to sign. They received about 1,500 or 2,000 from each of us." Verska estimates that UVZ employees have donated as much as 60 million rubles, $772,000, on the basis of previous press reports. It's not clear what the money was used for. Even where salaries have been increased, this has been more than offset by price rises due to inflation and sanctions, and by the burden of voluntary compulsory contributions, as a worker at the UEC Ufa Bridge Building Production Association notes. Quote, "I think that salaries have become higher relatively over the last year, but in real terms, they have become lower due to price increases. And now the salary cap has been reached, it is now being held back by taking away some bonuses. Changes not in favour of employees in pay regulations and other things." Likely due to the relatively low pay on offer, plants are reported to be suffering from a shortage of workers. Quote, "There is a large shortage of personnel because in principle were not enough of them, and when the war began, many quit," says a Strela worker. "The worker shortage is affecting plants' ability to increase production. At the Ulan Ude aviation plants, UAZ, a worker says that, quote, "We are simply not able to take on any additional volume. There are not enough people, engineers, testers." Another bottleneck is the supply of electronic components, which is now heavily restricted by sanctions. Strela is unable to increase production of missiles due to Russia's heavy dependence on Western chips. Quote, "In missile guidance systems, 90% of the components are Western, and these components are still in use. If Russia stops getting these components, it will not be able to make missiles quickly," Estrella employee notes. The military analyst, who is the chap, so who's this? Ian Matviv. He's the chap that did that whole big thread on the counteroffensives in Zaporizhia that Chris Owicki translated. Anyway, Chris Owicki refers to him saying the military analyst Ian Matviv comments that Russia's defense industry is unable to switch to a wartime mode of operations because of the systemic difficulties which have been worsened by the corrupt and self-serving nature of Putin's regime. Quote, in order to increase production, you need to build new facilities, new plants, but it is much more difficult and not a quick thing to do. Mishustin said 8 months ago that 2 tank repair plants would be built, and since then, nothing much is heard about them. Even if the salaries of workers are increased, there is no place to take them. There are not many specialists in this field, or they are already working elsewhere and do not particularly want to leave. The military industry is, as a whole, like all budgetary sectors, is very problematic, and the problems are systemic. They cannot be solved quickly. Mobilization of industry, he says, is impossible due to the nature of the regime. For that, you need the state to work and the leaders to be able to lead. But in fact, in Putin's system, everyone in the field is just sitting there for the sake of high salaries and corruption. So there you go. There's a bit of an insight into the defense industry. Yeah, not the details about how difficult it is for them to get the parts, the actual data of that would be super useful. But that is going to be a huge problem. But it's not the only problem. It is the workers. It is the factories. If you're going to up production, you need the factories. At every point in the production process, it seems there are issues. And that when you look at the asymmetry between these two sides, I keep talking about this. When you see the consistent degradation of the Russian forces, both in terms of personnel, so they're losing troops and replacing them with poorly trained conscripts or mobilized troops or convicts, and so on and so forth, you are getting a force quality issue going forward. And yes, that's an issue for the Ukrainians, but then the Ukrainians are also receiving huge amounts of training from NATO countries and forces. Great Britain, UK has trained over 10,000, and that's continuing. You've got training in Grafenwöhr in Germany by the Americans. You've got NATO forces in Europe. You've got it's not just UK, of course, it's UK and allies, all training so many of these Ukrainian soldiers, and not just soldiers, but in the logistics chains and all sorts. Whereas, what does Russia have in that sense? Well, nothing comparable to that at all. So you've got that force quality issue going on. But then there's a degradation of mechanized equipment. For every tank that's destroyed, the Russians can replace it with a worse tank only. They can get mothballed bits of equipment out from storage and try and shine them up. But a bit of buffing only goes so far. And these have less capability than the tanks they are replacing, and less capability than the tanks they are facing. Whereas Ukraine, on the other hand, when they are losing equipment, they are yes, they're capturing a lot of equipment and they're being able to fix up a lot of captured equipment, etc., but they are also getting better equipment given by the West consistently. So there is this asymmetry that has been taking place now for over a year. That has been going on, and we're going to get to this point in the counteroffensive where Ukraine are going to be bringing to bear quite a decent force of both personnel and mechanized equipment of all sorts, from armored recovery vehicles, armored engineering vehicles, drones. I mean, gazillions of drones with the United 24, 10,000 drone operators. You've got all sorts. It's only maybe the Air Force fixing aircraft where they are suffering compared to the Russians. The Russians still have that competitive advantage in that field, but probably in that field alone. I would say, and obviously Navy too. But when it comes to the army, there is the asymmetry that gap is only getting larger with each passing week, and Russia is unable to do anything about that because they can't replace those lost bits of kit with new bits of kit. They simply can't make it, or their production schedule only gives them a handful of these items per month or whatever. So this is hugely, hugely important. Right. talking about that kind of asymmetry, I'm going to bring this next. Actually, it makes a lot more sense. This is a really good segment from yesterday's Ukraine, the latest podcast from the Telegraph. This is Mike Martin, who's a senior visiting fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London, and he talks about these 4 areas where you can see who has that asymmetrical advantage. Over to him.
I said earlier, in a human, war is this human phenomenon. So things like strategy, logistics, training, and morale are actually much more important for determining the outcomes of war, like who wins and who loses. And you can almost
and those are 4 areas that are different to the area I was just talking about. Equipment, yeah, a little bit about training, but equipment. You could add to that just military equipment, stuff that's going to do the act of war.
Look at Russia and Ukraine, you can sort of judge them on a kind of scorecard for each of those things. And on each of those criteria, so strategy, logistics, training, and morale, Ukraine comes out on top of Russia. So, I mean, on strategy, what you want is a clear, enduring strategy, right? And Russia came in with a flawed strategy to take over the whole country. And that was largely based on flawed understanding of what Ukraine was and how well they would fight, but also an overestimation of the Russian armed forces. Whereas Ukraine has had a single goal that they have resourced well, largely by garnering support from the West, which is to remove all Russian soldiers from the territory of Ukraine. And what Russia's done is started out with these huge goals, these maximalist goals, and then slim them down. And now we're focusing on the Donbass, but really they're kind of focusing on a really Bakhmut. And actually, even
I wrote an article. I keep mentioning this back in April last year. Where to now, Putin? There, because there's no way you can win. And I talk about exactly this: how they slimmed down their plan A, which is that maximalist plan, Kiev overthrow. They went to plan B, which was to encircle Kiev. So that was overthrowing the government. Then it was to encircle Kiev, and then they failed at that. And then that went really badly. You got Mariupol getting involved. The problem with plan B to C plan B then went to plan C. Plan B and C both failed, and they had plan D, and plan D was rubbish, etc., etc., and so on and so forth. And that's where they still are. And because they don't have a clear goal, right? No one really knows what their goal is. And Putin came up with denazification, protecting the Donbass, all these kind of like, yeah, really? Is that what you originally were planning? No, it wasn't. Even those are a bit wishy-washy, and he doesn't seem to be doing things like everything he's doing at the moment is not towards those goals now. And it's just really bizarre. But that is still the case, where Ukraine have a very clear goal. It's obvious what their goal is get the Russians out of our country. Job done. That's a very right. Now that's our goal. How do we go about doing that? But if you don't have everything in life, your activity is goal orientated, right? What do I need to do? What's the best way of doing that? Okay, look, I'm going to get on and do that. No matter what you do in life, it's like, what's my goal? Okay, bish bash bosh. If the Russian troops apparently do not know what their goal is, they don't know why they're involved in this war. The commanders, I think, throughout the hierarchy, don't really know what the actual end goal is, and so this gives a sense of chaos, and that clarity is an advantage for Ukraine because the Russians just don't have that clarity.
Even now, we see them doing things that don't contribute to their stated goals. So their stated goal is to take the Donbass, but they have large numbers of troops tied up in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, which don't contribute to that overall strategic goal they've set themselves. So there's a lot of confusion on the Russian strategy and a very clear Ukrainian strategy. So one up to the Ukrainians. Logistics. The big scale, the Ukrainians are being backed by the richest countries in the world, except for China. And on the other side, the Russians are behind sanctions. And the important thing about sanctions is not making Russia poorer, but it's about cutting out Russia's ability to access things like gyroscopes and microchips and sensors, because that's the high-end weaponry, the guided missiles. It makes it much more difficult for Russia to produce those. And that's why we've seen Russia go to Iran, because Iran's also under sanctions, but Iran's very good at producing cheap, low-tech equipment. And so that's why we've seen particularly that confluence of interest between Russia and Iran. But at the smaller scale as well, can you supply the last 20 miles of your logistics to your forces under fire? And right from the beginning of the war. I mean, I don't know if many of your listeners might remember that famous 40-mile Russian tailback north of Kyiv that the Ukrainians just destroyed, and that's vital. You know, a mechanized or an armored division uses thousands of tons of supplies per day. So if you're, and particularly petrol and ammunition, and if you're taking that out, that means that it doesn't matter how many tanks you've got, they're not going anywhere, and they're just expensive targets. And again, on the other side, I think the Ukrainians have been much more successful at dispersing their logistics and stopping the Russians targeting them. So we've consistently seen, particularly with HIMARS supplied by the Western nations, we've consistently seen successful Ukrainian disruption of Russian logistics, including, you know, just in the last 10 days or so, these big fires at oil terminals in Crimea. And you think, so what? But everything runs on petrol. It's between 25 and it's between a quarter and a third of the overall logistics per weight is petrol and diesel and other oils. So if you knock out the refining terminals, it makes the army grind to a halt. Morale, just to whiz through the other two, morale and training. You know, the Ukrainians are backs to the wall, defending their homeland with high morale, and we've heard lots of stories of Russian troops, you know, deserting or arguing, and we've got Wagner arguing with the army and army arguing with the Chechens and so on and so forth. So, and then finally, training, and Ukraine as well has benefited from 8 years of training from NATO supporting countries. I mean, a lot of that army is now wiped out, but they've managed to create a training pipeline both within the country, but also utilizing, you know, in the UK, for instance, we've trained over 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And so there is a sort of continual pipeline of training of troops, whereas Russia, as we know, has had these mobilizations, and anyway, it's a conscript army, so the levels of training aren't that high. So yeah, on all of those four criteria, strategy, logistics, morale, and training, I think you can say, and really those four are the fundamentals of your ability to fight war successfully. Ukraine is out on top, and that's why I think both myself and probably a number of other experts right from the very start were saying, actually, Ukraine might have this. It's absolutely not going to be a Russian, you know, they're not just going to roll into Kyiv in a week or two, because actually these fundamental things, they're not doing very well. They might have a huge army, second biggest army in the world and all the rest of it, but if you don't do the basics, then you're not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely, bang on, really interesting. And it's that asymmetry that across all those different areas that is so important in dictating eventual success. He goes on to talk in a lot more depth about the logistics, saying how important logistics has been and how Ukraine have really hammered Russian logistics. And even though that Russia has the ability to produce all these oils and petrol and has those hydrocarbon reserves and whatnot, it's about getting that the last 100 meters to the front line. And if you're hammering the Russian logistics, and when HIMARS came along, they had to move back 100 kilometers. And if your depots are now all the way back there, then you're going to need far more journeys to get stuff in smaller quantities, I guess, but more consistently to the front line. And you're going to need twice as many trucks to do that. And if those trucks have been blown up and you didn't even start with enough trucks, I always say this, American army has about 100,000 trucks to do the equivalent sort of stuff that Russia started this war with 4,000 trucks. And, you know, half of them being destroyed. And so they have a real issue with getting petrol, getting ammunition and diesel and whatnot to the front line. And that makes a really significant difference. And this would make it even better if Ukraine could get hold of longer range missiles, because they'd had to reconfigure those logistical routes and schedules and everything. Again, it's wear and tear on the trucks as much as, you know, losing trucks to artillery. And you're starting to see Ukraine with longer range, you know, your basic artillery, the use of Caesars and Panzer howitzers that had that asymmetrical advantage over Russian artillery. And this just feeds into being a really big logistical challenge for Russia. He's then asked about the counteroffensive and how would a successful counteroffensive be executed. He talks about, obviously, Crimea is really important, Zaporizhia, cutting that land bridge between sort of Mariupol and Melitopol, making merry havoc, causing merry havoc for the Russians in terms of supplying their forces. Yeah, lots of conversation about that, and he's already talked about it needs to be big. You don't want this thing to drag on, particularly. So there's some people saying actually Ukraine should commit to a counteroffensive that is, you know, longer and more strategic and thinking about the long term of the war. And he was saying actually they will be thinking about things like, and I know this is controversial for some people, but he was saying very much they'll be looking at America and elections coming up, and they say if the Republicans win it in the US, it might have a negative impact. I'm not saying it will, and he's, but this is what this guy was saying. He said they're looking at that and thinking that there could well be a bit of an issue with continued American assistance, and so therefore they will want this counteroffensive to be the big one, right? It's not going to finish the war, but it needs to be a big statement, a big counteroffensive that has an effect both on the Kremlin, but also on supporters around the world that say, oh yeah, that was good, that was successful, we will continue, this is a good thing that we're behind, it's working, brilliant. Whereas if they go for this long attritional kind of way of doing things, then actually you could get yourself in trouble down the line when some of these countries have changes of governments, and and we're going to talk about that a little bit with Slovakia in a second. So anyway, I just pop back into what he says. This is just after talking about Zaporizhia and cutting that in two.
And that's, catastrophic. Now, obviously the Russians are aware of that. So that Zaporizhia front line is the most heavily entrenched, and, it's got all the trenches dug and the tank traps, and, there's lots of physical fortifications and all the rest of it. So, Ukraine has to be quite clever about how does it strike somewhere else to draw troops away. I mean, ultimately what Ukraine is hoping to do, and all good strategy should try and give dilemmas to its opponent, right? So what Ukraine is hoping to do is, by probing in different areas, is making Russia think, which of these areas do we defend? Do we spread ourselves very thinly? Do we defend all in this area? And you've got to keep them from knowing exactly what your plans are. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians don't know exactly where their final blow is going to fall.
This is super important. This is actually where I wanted to get to in this. I'll leave it just after this, but this is really important.
And the best way to create that dilemma, and in this, the Ukrainians are quite lucky because of the way that the Russians invaded. Effectively, if you look at the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces in Ukraine, you've actually got two concentric circles, if you like. And the Russians are on the outside. They go from kind of the northeast all the way through the Donbass, down through Mariupol, all the way along to Kherson. That's a kind of bigger circle. And the Ukrainians are on a smaller circle. Their front lines are smaller because they're inside. They're the inside circle, and the Russian forces are the outside circle. And what that means is that Ukraine can move units and assets, equipment and men and all the rest of it around from different bits of the front line much quicker than Russia can. And not to mention that Ukraine's doing it in friendly territory and Russia's doing it in occupied territory and all the rest of it. There's, occupied territory that's got partisans in it and all that kind of stuff. And what that means is that in order to create this dilemma for Russia, Ukraine can move assets up and down the line and hit them in the northeast and probe up there and do a river crossing in Kherson and so on and so forth. Hit logistics here, hit logistics there, just to keep the Russians, and this is what's happening at the moment, basically. They're shaping the battlefield, and they're probing here, and they're destroying the logistics hub there, and then they're going over to the other side of the battlefield, and they're knocking out a command hub, and then they've got some partisans to destroy a railway yard in Tokmak, and so on and so forth. The idea being to create complete confusion and dilemmas for the Russians about exactly where or what this strike is going to look like. And I think ultimately what they're trying to do is get the Russians to be moving things up and down the front line, because effectively what could start out as a Ukrainian probing attack, if the Russians don't rush troops there to defend that could then become the main effort for the Ukrainians, and they push through. And this is what I mean by, I think the Ukrainians have got quite a flexible, well, if I were them, I would have a very flexible approach to this. The idea being to just see what the Russians do. And if they don't reinforce somewhere, you push there. If they do reinforce there, you just flick to another axis and go over there. And that's the beauty of the geography, where they have internal lines and the Russians have external lines.
Really good point, and this is quite similar to the deep battle approach or strategy doctrine of the Soviet army that the Russians seem to be trying to do in their offensive, their winter and spring offensive that kind of failed. But the idea is you probe, find a weakness, and then you pile in and exploit that weakness. Now, there could well be this idea that the Ukrainians might have their larger ideas of where they're going to attack, but if that is too difficult, if the Russians have actually built up successful defenses in these places, they might need to probe and probe and probe and find a weakness somewhere else, and it might be that you adapt. And Mick Ryan talks a lot about this, about adaptation on the battlefield and in strategizing what you're going to be doing, operationally speaking. And it might be that, right, okay, it turns out that Bakhmut is really weak, and that's a good place to push on through, catch a load of troops, even though we know that we need to go down to the coast in Azov. But it's just, maybe we just can't do that without fixing a load of Russian troops to be brought up to Bakhmut to defend that area, and then we hit down. So it might be that the Ukrainians might have a general idea of what they need to do, but it could go in many different ways, and they don't really know where they are going to do one of their main thrusts and attacks and so on and so forth. There's going to be an element of, suck it and see. And anyway, there's lots more that this guy says. I really advise going to watch Ukraine, the latest, yesterday's one. It's really very good. I'll link to my article, Where to Now, Putin, There's No Way You Can Win. I know I did that the other day, and a couple of people read that, and so someone said, this is so prescient that I'm going to call you Nostradamus. Like back in April last year, I maintain that this holds up really well. This article is exactly how it's kind of panned out, and that he can't win, and he still can't win. But there you go. Talking about changes of government, we're going to have a little look at Slovakia for a short while. Now, this is a snippet from a very good video giving you an overview of Slovakian political situation at the moment. Why Slovakia's government collapsed. So their government has just collapsed. They've got an interim sort of government with some technocratic government, which means they've got experts who aren't necessarily politicians in charge of certain positions. The video, why Slovakia's government collapsed and why it's bad news for Ukraine, is a good one from TLDR News EU. Now, you've missed the whole beginning bit about who all these people are. So the first few seconds, I'm not actually going to explain because it's a bit too confusing. There were pro-Russian party that kind of split over time and has come back in a different way with this previous leader. I think who's going to start talking about, who is vying to become leader again. And you've got a woman who's in charge at the moment, who is your kind of interim leader, who is in charge of more of a pro EU party, but it's looking like the pro-Russians from different parties might take power in some kind of coalition. But anyway, over to them.
So what happens next? Well, unsurprisingly, all this chaos is a golden opportunity for Robert Fico and his SMER party, who were already polling ahead of Pellegrini's HLAS before the crisis. A Fico victory would be bad news, at least from the EU's perspective, because he's remarkably pro-Russian and anti-Ukraine. Fico has said he would end arms deliveries to Ukraine, veto any new EU sanctions and Ukraine's accession to NATO, and claimed that Ukrainian fascists started the war in Ukraine in 2014. Now, because SMER...
That's basically having Putin in charge of Slovakia, by the sounds of it.
Still polling at less than 20%, and Slovakia uses a proportional representation electoral system, Fico won't be able to get a majority by himself. However, he has a natural ally in the Republic movement, which splintered from the neo-fascist Slovak People's Party, and is polling at around 8% of the vote, who are also pro-Russian. If you don't live in Slovakia, the success of these pro-Russian parties might seem a bit odd, given how most generally anti-Russian the rest of Europe is. But the Slovak public are actually the most pro-Russian in the EU. According to polling from September last year.
Which is interesting. I mean, this is maybe something I wasn't aware of this. I know Slovakia fairly well. My friends, one of my best mates has got a backpackers in the Tatras Mountains in Slovakia. Been out there a number of times in Žďár. Lovely place, but yeah.
Over half of the population wants Russia to win the war, with only about 30% rooting for Ukraine and the remaining 20% saying they don't know. Even before the war, in 2021, a different poll recorded 56% of Slovaks agreeing with the notion that NATO is provoking Russia. Unsurprisingly, Slovaks therefore generally oppose sanctions on Russia. According to the latest Eurobarometer polling, 44% of Slovaks disagree with sanctions, the highest figure in the EU. So, is Slovakia destined to elect a pro-Kremlin government led by Fico? In short, no, it isn't. At least not yet. Progressive Slovakia, a social liberal party co-founded by President Čaputová,
so she's now the president at the moment,
has also seen a steady rise to third place in the polls. Since the party was excluded from the government coalition at the last election, it's not associated with the recent chaos, and also benefits from the fact that Čaputová remains the most trusted figure in Slovak politics. It's also worth mentioning that, for a functioning majority, Fico would probably need the support of a third party, like the conservative We Are Family movement or the Christian Democrats, both of which vocally support Ukraine. However, the constant bickering among pro-Western and pro-Ukraine politicians doesn't bode well for them. SAS and the Progressives have ruled out working with Matovic, and they're not too eager to work with Hager's New Democrats party either. The emergence of a whole load of pro-Western parties like the Blues and Apple is also worrying, because chances are they'll split the pro-Western vote while failing to reach the 5% threshold.
So basically, there could be problems in Slovakia, and you've got, and this is a problem in the UK. We have big time, which is, and I'm not being pro either side here, I'm just factually laying it out, that the Conservatives have, say, the right, and there is no competition for the Conservatives. There used to be UKIP, but they don't really exist anymore. So you just got the Conservatives have the entire right vote, and on the left you've got Liberal Democrats, so centre left, you've got Labour that are left, you've got Green that are left, and then you've got localised one like SNP up in Scotland, Plaid Cymru in Wales, and that means that in your left vote is split 4 to 5 sort of different ways, which means that in first past the post, because we don't have proportional representation in the UK, it's first past the post. It means that if you're going to split the left vote in every constituency up and down the country, the Conservatives will walk into many places where actually they don't have a majority of people wanting them. So if you had second choice voting, a ranked voting scheme, actually most people don't want the Conservatives in some constituencies to be in charge. So there's like more of an anti-Conservative vote, but they still get in because all of those people are split between different parties, and their votes are not taken into account if their own candidate isn't first past the post. And that's I could bore you about why first past the post is a really problematic, undemocratic voting system. It has some advantages, but on broadly speaking, the US has this as well. And in fact, it's broadly a voting system that only colonial nations of the British Empire seem to have as a kind of leftover. You look at any new democracies, they do not take on first past the post. Is proportional representation is a voting system of choice because of all the advantages, and it's far more democratic. I live in a constituency here on the south coast of the UK, and I'm so politically active, and yet my vote, I might as well not get up on voting day and vote. I might as well not vote, because my party, whatever party I vote for, if it's not the Conservatives are a shoo-in here, right? So they'll win every single time. But my vote isn't counted. There's no like second ranking. There's no proportional representation. So just because my candidate won't get in, like, and they will never get in, that means my vote is therefore worthless. So my vote, I actually feel disenfranchised in our political voting system in the UK. So proportional representation gives you that, but as he's talking about here, it does mean that generally you'll have to work in coalitions, and people like they use that as kind of a scare argument against proportional representation. But actually, coalitions work fine. We had a coalition with the Liberal Democrats and Tories, and actually, on paper, they got the most things achieved out of any government of the last however long. You know, they actually work really well together, and so that was directly against the argument that coalitions don't work. Anyway, you get the point. So in Slovakia there are coalitions, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out with their proportional representation, whether the votes are split and who gets eventually in charge, and whether that ruling party or that ruling coalition will be anti-Ukraine, and it could well be. And actually, that's probably a good place to leave it. I have a big old Mick Ryan thread I was going to do, but I'll leave that for tomorrow, because otherwise the video will be too long, because I don't half like talking, right? Anyway, thank you so much for watching this. Hopefully it was of use, of interest. Please like, subscribe and share. Thank you so much for all the wonderful ways you support the channel. All the ways you can do that in the description below. That is to say, buy me a coffee, PayPal, memberships and all that kind of stuff. So members are great. Thank you so much. You can also pop on to uasupporter.com/ATP, and any stash you get from there gives the channel a little bit of commission. So that's always appreciated. Anyway, take care. Speak to you soon.